Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for making a little bit of time to join us for this program. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm a director here at Mina Partners, and we've got a conversation scheduled for you today on third-party risk management, key tips for success. We've got a really great discussion planned for you. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Alessio DePaula from KnowBe4. Alessio, thanks for making some time to be with us today. And so we're going to get started in just a minute. But before we do, I wanted to remind everybody that's joined us here, if you're listening to this live, we encourage you to ask questions. There is a comment section just below in your interface there. So please feel free to type in questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can on the live program. And so with that, let me turn to Alessio. And Alessio, can you tell us a little bit about your current role over at KnowBe4 and a little bit about your professional background?
Yeah, of course. And Dave, thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here. It's actually one of my favorite topics. I think something that's super important today. But to give everybody a little background on myself, my name is Lester DePaula. I am the VP of Data Protection for KnowBe4. My previous role was at a different tech company that focused more on HIPAA compliance with the privacy and security rule. I eventually moved on to KnowBe4. I actually started off as a privacy analyst, became director of privacy, and my role kind of kept expanding from there. So I went from managing the privacy program to managing the vendor third-party risk program, and eventually also added, I would say, our DLP program, which is monitoring for egress or ingress of data, or some people can also call it insider risk. However you name it, it's pretty much the same thing. And I've been doing that here for about 8 years now, and it's been a great time. And I'm hoping that I can share some insights with you guys today, just anything that you can take away that can ultimately help you guys with your programs.
Yeah, terrific. And so you can hear from Alessio's background why I invited him here for this topic specifically. He's got a lot of experience and he's seen a lot over the years. And it's a topic that we here at Mina Partners deal with all the time. We help our clients design, build, and maintain their privacy programs. And of course, a lot of that has to do with managing vendors and data flows in and out of the organization, as you heard. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And Alessio, to begin the conversation, can you talk to us a little bit about what you think are some of the kind of key priority areas for somebody who was say charged at an organization with getting started with a vendor management program? I mean, I can imagine that would be a pretty overwhelming task if you're at an organization and you have a relatively mature program. Maybe you've been handed a spreadsheet with a list of vendors, but there hasn't been a lot of auditing or checking or data protection agreements put in place, et cetera. What just from the ground floor for somebody kind of getting started, what would be some of your key areas to focus on, would you say?
Yeah, I think just like with anything else, is making sure that you have the buy-in from everyone else in the organization and figuring out kind of who your key players are, who could really help you in your endeavor. They might not be a privacy professional or security professional. It might be somebody in the procurement department. It might be somebody in the legal department. And ultimately, these people will kind of help you get things going on your side, because maybe they're already in communication with some of your vendors. So it's also identifying what the current process is for even bringing on a vendor. So
Yeah.
don't try to recreate the wheel, really. If you see, okay, well, this is the process that we have for whenever a vendor comes through, how do I put myself in there without making things too difficult for everybody, and just really kind of enabling them to do what they need to do, but also making sure that we analyze the security and privacy component as well. And then from there, you just establish those relationships. And if it's not a formal process that you have, maybe you're the one who makes the push to formalize it. But if it is a formal process, it's really try to get yourself included in there. Identify what your requirements are. Make sure you're at the right, I would say, stage of that process, because you don't want to be too late when they've already fully made the decision to pay them and sign the PO. You want to be early enough to where you can identify some problems if there are any, and then you go ahead and deal with that. And then your relationship with legal is huge because they help you execute the privacy agreements, security agreements, help you understand any odd language, and you could send them any weird terms that you might find. A lot of times you'll see beta terms for programs, you'll see free trial terms, and I think the legal department is really huge in helping with that.
Yeah, that's terrific. That makes a lot of sense. And hearing you talk about that, Leslie, made me think of a couple things I want to kind of dig into and dive into a little bit deeper. So let's put a pin in one, which is at what point do you feel like it's useful to move from spreadsheets and kind of in-house, maybe Office 365 tools to an automated platform, which obviously involves some spending and configuration. So I want to talk about that, but let's put that aside. But before we get into that, I think what you're talking about with relationships is interesting. Third-party risk management and managing vendors has a lot to do with having solid relationships with the people in your organization, if you've been charged with this, in the legal department, in the marketing department, in procurement, with leadership. At the very least, you're going to have some interactions there. So building up those relationships and having those folks understand why this is important. And something you and I talked about when we were preparing for this was that you don't want to be the department of no.
Mhm.
It's your job to try to minimize risk and to keep bad things from happening. At the same time, we have to all understand that we want to be a business enablers. We want to understand that we want the business to move forward. So trying to strike that fine balance between allowing the business to move forward and enabling the business to move forward while minimizing risks and bad problems that happen that could occur with data is a tricky kind of a tightrope to walk. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, I completely agree. I think it's hard just because when people think of compliance as a whole, because some people put privacy, security under, all can be separate functions, but they usually see it as something that is going to block you or make life more difficult. But ultimately, we're just trying to allow you to do what you want to do, but in a way that's safe and that won't bring too much harm to the business if things go wrong. There's
Right.
always some level of residual risk that exists with most
Mhm.
things. You can't ever protect things 100%. You read a privacy notice, it always says, our security controls might never be or will never be 100% effective or something like that. And there's a reason that's there because nothing is, but you can do your best to make it as good as you can. And we're the department of yes, but and instead of no. So it's yes, but you just need to do this. Maybe you need to implement this, or hey, how about a little bit of a different approach? And establishing those relationships with those individuals just really helps you kind of push the narrative that you need in order to ensure that they implement the right process and that you're doing things in a compliant manner. You don't want to ever really try to do something that is not necessary. I think a way that it gets put to me is, I get asked, is that a fact about certain things, right? So let's say you want to perform some marketing activities in a country. There are certain regulations and laws and things of that nature, right? And I say, well, you have to get consent for marketing to these individuals. You might need to get double opt-in for marketing to these individuals. And, you might get asked, is that a fact? And you need to be able to respond to that accurately. So you can't base things off of just, we think this would be just the best way to do it. Unless you frame it that way, you can frame it that this would, this is the best practice. However, here's the minimum required that is needed, but generally people choose the minimum required. So this really taking kind of there's risk-based approaches, right, that is included in this, but just identifying what the facts are and what actually needs to be done and making sure that you can leverage those relationships to present it to those key leaders or whoever's making the decision, and that they trust you and trust what you're saying because they know that you're letting them know exactly what can or can't be done and what needs to be done.
Yeah, and here's a tip that I'll offer up to our audience in terms of what you were just talking about, Alessio, which is I'm a big believer in providing context for people, letting them know why we're doing this. So for instance, on internal IT security awareness campaigns that we do both at Mina Partners and we help our clients with as well. I think people are a lot more willing and excited to participate in these efforts of due diligence when they understand the actual dangers. So, sharing some horror stories, making people aware of the potential threats and what exactly could happen if things go wrong, and why it's important to have, as tight a program as possible. As you mentioned, it's never possible to get to zero risk. Is helpful for people, and people will react really well when they are shown the context and what could happen. So I said a moment ago I wanted to get back to like program management. So let's go ahead and revisit that now. And I know most immature programs or young programs are just getting started tend to use in-house tools. But at some point, your vendor management program may involve hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors. At what point do you think it's a good idea to start investigating a platform that helps you manage vendors, Lesio? And what do you see as some of the advantages of these without getting into actual product names? What would kind of enable that expenditure, and what do you get out of it? What has been your experience and the benefits of moving to a platform as opposed to using in-house tools?
Yeah, I would say as soon as possible, because if your business is growing, you're going to have to scale, and
Mhm.
there will come a time where you might need to do that very quickly because things become unmanageable. So just doing that at the start, but I'll say it'll still work if you're using a spreadsheet, via Word document, whatever you're using. I think where it gets difficult to manage is when you are starting to do annual reviews on existing vendors and collecting
Mhm.
more documentation on those vendors. So now you're storing, 2021, 2022, 2023. You have all
Yeah.
those documents. You're trying to keep all that there, and keeping that organized is difficult. Then you add more team members into the mix. And then it just becomes just super difficult to track where everything is. Um, so I think kind of as early as you can. And I know that there are always expenses with these tools, right? So, I always like to say too, that always look at open source stuff. I just say that about anything. I think that's always,
There's a lot available up there, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot available there. And that goes for anything, not just this sort of tool, right? It can be whatever it is. Um, but in terms of enabling the expenditure, it's just really showing what your value is to the business and making sure that as we've spoken about before, that you establish those relationships and you can provide evidence and monetary terms on what either cost savings are, or the importance of doing what you're doing. Or if you don't have something that can show something in a monetary sense, well, provide the compliance drivers. So for us, we are SOC 2 certified, we have ISO certifications, FedRAMP authorized, and these are a ton of compliance requirements, and you
Mhm.
need something that helps you manage all of that, and
Right.
that is inclusive of vendor management, that is inclusive of privacy, that's inclusive of just general audit management, right? So those ultimately provide a value because this is the expectation for our customers. They expect us to have adequate privacy controls, adequate security controls, and ultimately that does also help kind of drive revenue in a way, because it's what's needed essentially to do business. And so you present what the drivers are, and you can take that kind of customer based approach. Like, this is what our customers expect of us. And we need a tool that helps us manage this because it's not possible to do it without it. And I think that really helps you, and uh, not only get your foot in the door, but also expand that, right? Because you'll go with a tool and you might get one module, but then you might need a second module for another aspect of the program. You might need a third
Mhm.
module. So ultimately, that can grow with you. And I think that that's just a good way to go about it. And managing it all in one place is probably the best. If, I would also look internally. Maybe there is a tool that some team is leveraging that you can kind of piggyback off of. Uh, it might not be a perfect tool, but maybe it's something that can help you in the meantime, or maybe it could
Like an
be.
interim step.
Yeah. So it's just kind of seeing what's available internally too, because a lot of the time there are some things that can be available, or you can kind of make it work for you. But usually a dedicated tool is the best, and helps you manage a lot of things. So myself, I know I'm going on this, but I manage our vendor management. I manage privacy. So having something that helps me kind of manage those two together, because
Yeah, in an integrated way.
yeah, it just makes the most sense. Most companies are leveraging SaaS products. That's where a lot of the data is. That's where a lot of the integrations come from. So just having all of that detailed in a system that I can then refer back to that vendor if I'm doing a PIA, or if I'm doing a ROPA, or record of processing activity, anything like that. The data is there. I have the data. I just now need to conduct the assessment, or whatever else I need to do. So it just really streamlines the whole process.
Terrific. I do want to come back to talking about PIA, since you mentioned PIA. It's something we discussed in our planning session for this. But before we do, let's say whether you're using in-house tools, or you've decided to leverage a platform and make that investment, what would you say are some of the kind of key steps in due diligence with your vendors? I mean, let's talk about assessments. Let's talk about audits, and importantly, something you and I also talked about in preparing for this, prioritizing your higher risk vendors over your lower risk vendors.
Yeah. So there is a lot when it comes to third party risk, and I think everybody should be doing a certain baseline. But if you're just a one person shop and you're just trying to collect documents and review everything, that might be difficult for you, right? So just really identifying like some key elements that are from a compliance perspective, like strictly needed. Right now, I'm kind of just going to base it off of what we kind of do when we look at our vendors, right? So of course, you start with your data processing agreement. You do need to get one of those in place. Again, it's not always in scope for the vendor, depending on what they're doing. And it can get complicated too with controller, processor, all of those things. Luckily, the new SDCs made it a lot easier to kind of handle all of that. It's still something to identify. In terms of other documentation, we look at it from a security perspective as well. So SOC 2 reports, ISO report, statement of applicability. We do get, to the extent some vendors want to provide it, it's actually difficult to get like vulnerability scans and penetration tests. You need to execute some sort of NDA or sign up for a third-party portal. You'll be able to get those, and those are helpful as well from that aspect. And sometimes these organizations have, I would say, I guess it's a PIA. It's not super in depth, but you'll be able to access it online via their documentation or something like that. So collecting that as well is super helpful. And then once you collect all that, you can ultimately go in and conduct your assessment. So, in a PIA, you generally get asked about security controls, right? Is data encrypted? Do they have this? Do they have that? And, that's identified in the SOC 2 report. Looking at scope of processing and what that vendor is actually going to do. You'll see that in the DPA. And I say that, but there's always scope creep with vendors.
Yeah, we should talk about this a minute, because we discussed it in our planning session too.
Yeah.
This is at the core of good, solid vendor management, right? Is what processing activities have been approved as per the DPA in a written contract, and is that what you want this vendor to be doing? And is there any scope creep? It's really at the heart of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Is if that scope creep happens, this is a key place where you can increase the risk to your organization, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, just being honest, it's one of the most difficult things to deal with right now.
Yeah.
It's just not, I don't think anybody's alone in dealing with this issue, because it's just very common. Vendors are, they have multiple modules, multiple tools, multiple services, right? And how are you going to get notified if something gets turned on, and if that user base starts leveraging that part of the product, and all of a sudden you have this other processing activity occurring? You just might not know until come renewal time, or until somebody mentions it somewhere and you're like, huh, what? I don't remember approving that.
Yeah, and it's good to keep your ear to the ground, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. A
that's
lot.
how you find out about these things. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of things you just kind of hear about, or depending on what kind of internal chat system. So if you have like Slack, right, you'll be in public channels, and sometimes you'll be just scrolling through, and you'll see something like, oh, that's a little bit different than what I know. Let me go check this real quick. And that's what's
Mhm.
also good about having a system that's easy to
Yeah.
query and stuff for documentation. Is
Platform. Yeah.
easy reference back. You just say,
Mhm.
oh, okay, oh no, never mind, this was approved, right?
And you can
And
take notes too. You can
yeah,
leave notes in there, and you can see where you last left off there. Yeah.
exactly. It just makes
Mhm.
it manageable and scalable to do that. But it's like the scope of processing activities, I think, changes quite a bit. Generally, DPAs are pretty broad, right? So they
Mhm.
just cover just about everything. They say for the services pursuant to the MSA or terms of service. You look at the MSA terms of service, that's pretty broad as well, pretty encompassing of most tools or services that they might provide. Sometimes
Mhm.
ones that are outside of scope that might have like a separate addendum.
Mhm.
Those won't get turned on unless one of those get executed. Um, so from a DPA perspective, you might be okay, right? But from a documentation perspective and actually knowing what your processing purposes are and identifying your legal basis, you may not be. So,
Mhm.
and also just not not just looking at documentation, it's just what is the system actually doing, what data is going there, because ultimately our concern is documentation is one thing, but it's actually protecting the data and protecting our company's assets is the most important piece of this. So
Mhm.
if all of a sudden something else gets turned on and there's a ton of sensitive data going there that I didn't know about, well, all of a sudden we have another data store. That's another place that could potentially be breached. That's users potentially downloading sensitive data from somewhere, uploading it to another location, and you just really have to look at it from that perspective as well to really try to protect your company as much as you can.
Yeah, so this is another key takeaway, hopefully, for the program. For those of you out in the audience, is pay particular attention to the processing activities and the data elements that are actually being utilized by these vendors, and prioritize them, and have a highest risk category that you pay more attention to, and maybe you review that DPA and that MSA a little bit more carefully, and make sure that you really are legal is really in line with all of the clauses that are in place there, and save some time by not necessarily paying as much attention to other vendors that may be not processing as much personal information or sensitive information, and create and represent a much lower risk to the organization. So really can't understate the importance of prioritizing your
Oh
vendors
yeah,
and what they're processing, right?
no, agreed. I forgot to touch on that one, but that is one of the most important keys, I think, especially if you're a smaller team, just really focusing on criticality of the vendor, right? What data they're processing, um like what will happen if that vendor goes down for a day, right? Are there
Mhm.
backups to that? Okay, well, if there's not, and if that is just pretty much shuts down the business, then that is a super critical vendor.
Mhm.
Make sure that's something that gets reviewed, because ultimately if there is a security issue that messes with the operations of that vendor and that vendor is no longer functional, and that security issue wasn't identified during the documentation phase and it was there, well, that
Mhm.
ultimately falls back on us for not identifying that because it was available. But just focusing on those high risk vendors that are super important to the business, that process a ton of data, whether it's HR data, financial data, could be CRM data. Sometimes you might not see marketing contacts or leads as super important. And while they might not be sensitive in a legal perspective, it's generally in a system that's super important for the business to continue functioning and doing all their documentation and what they need to do.
Mhm.
So,
Not to mention for B2C companies, the trust
yeah,
issue between
no,
customers. Yeah.
exactly. And if you need to fulfill DSARs, right, or something like that, and you're trying to fulfill your compliance obligations, and these systems that you need to be able to access and
Yeah.
do stuff with are down, well, how am I going to fulfill my compliance requirements at that point?
Right. Right.
Become
Exactly.
So I was just going to leave it with, I didn't get a good cadence for reviewing your vendors. It can be
Mhm.
at renewal time. It can be annually for lower risk vendors, it can be like not biannually is twice a year. So, every 2 years, right? So so we actually have it to where for some vendors that don't really process any data, or it might be just a small tool somebody uses, that might be on a, every 2 year cadence that we might go ahead and look at that. But just, and then identifying what risky means to you exactly. Don't always try to go off some other template that somebody else is using, because that might not work for you. And you're going to try to implement it, and you'll eventually realize, and I've been through this, you'll do it and you're like, this doesn't really work for me. It doesn't really make sense. It's not helpful. So identify what's helpful to you and what makes the most sense for your business. And then from there, you can expand on what you're doing.
I really like that, Alessio, and it seems straightforward to some of us and common sense, but to actually think through whether the templates that you're using, the assessments that you're using, are they up to date? Do they need refreshing? Are they accurate? And just to close, let me talk about something that's probably on everybody's mind. I mean, hopefully the majority of your vendors have been, well vetted. They've been, they've got good DPAs in place. You understand the processing activities, but in the situations where, let's say, there has been some scope creep of the processing, or there has been something that raises eyebrows in terms of a security issue at the vendor, and there needs to be a little bit of investigation. What's been your experience with whether you can typically work with these companies to understand what's happening, or what the gap might be between what you want to require of them and what they're able to provide, and whether they can kind of adjust for that, or whether in some instances, I'm sure it's not reconcilable and you just need to go find a vendor in the space that provides a similar service. Can you talk a little bit about, in your experience, how those situations can tend to play out?
Yeah, I'll say for the vast majority, it's good. You're able to work with the vendor. You work with also your internal vendor owner as well. We always like to include them so they can see kind of what we go through when we're working with third parties, because sometimes they're non-responsive, sometimes they're combative. Sometimes they're very helpful. So we always include the vendor owners in those communications. It just really lets them see like what our process is, why we're making a certain decision.
That's really great. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And with scope creep and things like that, for, like I said, for some it's super easy. For others, it is not, right? And I have there's an example that I have where we were leveraging a tool that was meant to be local only, right? So meaning only on your device, data doesn't go absolutely anywhere else, which is approved for, a certain subset of users. All of a sudden, the scope changed, and, we weren't necessarily notified or aware of the situation, and data started somehow going up to the cloud. Now you're thinking, oh, well, what data was being stored or processed locally from the users, and what data is now going up to the cloud, and how do we get rid of that? Essentially, how do we delete that data, figure something out and bring it back locally? We kind of realize you can't just necessarily keep it locally. So we say, oh, okay, well, we're kind of on a fact-finding mission at this point. Okay, what are the facts of the situation? There's data in the cloud, used to be local, there's no way to change it. This was only approved for local use. We presented that to the business and essentially said, hey, we need to make a change. And we also try to find a reasonable alternative. And it's not necessarily on the security or vendor risk team, right, to always find alternatives, but we don't like to present a problem without a solution. So we found an alternative that met all of the requirements, same costs, et cetera, right? We said, hey, we need to move off this tool onto this one. Got approval from the business. And then from there, we pretty much created kind of like a campaign to move off the service and make sure accounts got deleted and things of that nature. And I'm saying this like it was all super easy or something. I'm
going to say it sounds like quite a lift to me, but again,
okay,
you're doing your due diligence, you're protecting the organization, you're doing what you have to do. This is why the third-party risk management program is in place, really, is in these situations when a change needs to be made. It's not easy, it takes some time and effort, but it's the right thing to do.
It took time and effort and a lot of communication. And I will not like say this enough. It's just communication is everything. Your relationships with key leaders is also everything to help you do what you need to do. I think when we've run into situations like the one I mentioned, Dave, it's having those relationships is just what helped us move along, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily getting a ton of blockers along the way, just everybody understood, they understood the mission and what needed to be done. And, leveraging those relationships just made it happen quickly and just efficiently. And we move on and we're better for it. Right. So, just communicate, always present, what are the facts of the situation? Because people will really understand that too. They'll say, hey, I know that this person, whenever they provide information, it's just really clear. It's just really fact-based. It's based on this criteria. And, I just understand it. And from there, I have trust in it, and we can make a good decision off it.
That's perfect. And that's also a great place to end. Unfortunately, we're just out of time here. We're at the bottom of the hour. So, Alessio, thank you so much for your time today. I know you've got a lot on your plate always, and really appreciate you making a little time for us to be on the program and for this conversation. Provided a lot of insight, I hope, for the audience. And as you can see, there's contact information for myself and for Alessio on the banner on the bottom of the screen. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everybody, take us to a program close, and we'll see you on the next program.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Alessio.